unit, we're going to be looking at a series of lessons about water resources, and then we'll move into water pollution and water contamination. So you're going to see that there's a lot of parts to this, and part of it, the biggest part of it, is that importance of fresh water and that availability of fresh water and how much there is around on the planet, and then what's the challenges with extracting that water from different places. So if we're looking at groundwater, or if we're looking at using surface water and having dams and reservoirs, um, how do we get the water from one place to the other? Because, for example, here in the valley, we have a very large population, and if we weren't transporting water here, we wouldn't have enough water for our population. So how do we get the water here, and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of getting the water in these areas? We look at some other kind of solutions for our water problem, and then we look at water conservation as well. On the flip side of that, every once in a while we have the problems of too much water, and so we'll talk about flooding as well. So one of the case studies, there's a number of case studies in your notes. You're going to want to make sure that you've gone through them all. But one of the real possibilities in the world is that the next conflict or worldwide conflict is not going to be fought over oil, it's going to be fought over water. And because in some areas of the world, water is such a scarce resource, and when you have multiple countries that don't necessarily always get along, who are trying to share that same water resource, if there aren't agreements that are worked out, that can lead to conflict. And if you look at this map of the Middle East, you see how, first of all, there's no major surface water sources that go all through the Sinai Peninsula here. And so that's kind of a problem in and of itself because you have a large number of people who live in this area. In some areas, there's a lot of poverty sprinkled in with some very large pockets, with some small pockets of large wealth. Um, but when you look at where the water is, and you look at here where the Tigris and the Euphrates, these were, remember, if you remember way back into like your sixth grade social studies, this is where the birthplace of humanity is supposed to have been, where agriculture was born in this area in between and right around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But if you look and you see, even with the Tigris and the Euphrates, the headwaters for these major rivers that are so important and bring so much water are in a different country. They're up here in Turkey. And so Turkey decided to change their mind about letting water flow down through into Syria and Iraq. Um, they really could change the face of this region by building some dams and keeping all that water up in Turkey. It wouldn't necessarily be the wisest decision just from the stability of the region, but it's something that could very quickly come to pass, or they could just start drawing more water out. And we'll talk a little bit about what happens um, in those cases. Here in the United States, the Colorado River, that we'll talk about a little bit later on, um, also has, we have some of these, we look at where the Colorado starts and all of the states that it goes through and down into Mexico, we have these water agreements that don't currently exist in the Middle East. And so here we know that if certain lake levels trigger or certain, um, there's so many cubic feet per minute of water that are flowing down the Colorado, that starts to drop. We already have in place what the agreements are going to be and where the water priorities are. And I can tell you that right now, for our neck of the woods, like if the water levels drop in Lake Mead, that the San Joaquin Valley has priority over the Phoenix metro area. So if the water levels were to drop, the priority would be there because that's where a lot of our fruits and vegetables. It's a huge agricultural area, and so they're going to make sure that the water is going to our agricultural area first, so we can still continue to feed the western part of the United States. So, but that doesn't necessarily exist in other areas of the world, which can lead to conflicts later on. So obviously it's important. Um, we know that water is important as far as the human condition for, um, for our survival. But we also look at water as a huge climate moderator. Um, Not only does it does end up changing the land, but it's also a dilution source for pollutants, and it's continually moving and recycling. But that being said, there's just a tiny fraction. So everybody knows the Earth is about 70% water, right? but most of that's not even available to us. When we look at what of that is fresh water and then what's not locked up in the ice caps, most of that water is not available to us. When we look at how the distribution of the water resources, looking at that versus the population, you're going to see that the areas with the highest populations do not necessarily have the highest water resources. And that's where some of this conflict can come into play because you have more people and you don't have a way to, you don't have enough water for your people. You don't have enough water, then remember that leads to agriculture. That ties in with agriculture. So if you don't have enough water to grow crops, then you're not going to be able to feed the population that you have. Just a really quick review of the water cycle. Most of the water cycle I would expect that you would already know from previous science classes. You would know about precipitation and evaporation and condensation in that part. We're going to focus a little bit more on the infiltration portion, where the precipitation goes down into the groundwater. We'll talk about aquifers and how the groundwater is stored. Um, we're also going to be concentrating on our surface water because that's where a lot of our water resources come from. And we'll talk about some different watersheds or drainage basins. And this is just all the areas. So like the drainage basin for the Mississippi River Valley is actually about 2/3 of the United States. It's really, really big. Um, the drainage basin for the Colorado River is a lot smaller. If you've ever gone through the Rocky Mountains and you crossed over the Continental Divide, that's what you were crossing over was that point where all the water to the east of the Continental Divide will end up in the Mississippi River, and all the water to the west will end up going towards the Pacific, and a good deal of that will end up in the Colorado. Not all of it, but a good deal of it. Not all of the water on the east side will go into the Mississippi, but a lot of it will. So when we look at this, is just a diagram of the water cycle, which should be familiar to you. We're going to talk about some things that maybe you haven't talked about in the past. We're going to add on to this a little bit because we're going to be talking about our confined aquifers and our unconfined aquifers. And we're going to be looking at these permeable and impermeable layers that sort of change the water quality as you look at aquifers. So most of our water right now, we use surface water. We do withdraw water from aquifers, but a lot of it doesn't go back down into that area, obviously, because if we're pulling water out of the aquifer, we're pumping it for agriculture. We're not necessarily putting it right back into that source. It's going into plants, a lot of it, right? And then it's being moved away. So irrigation would be for agriculture and would be our biggest water use. So today I want you to think a little bit about, we talked about agriculture a little while back, and I want you to think a little bit about how we can decrease the amount of fresh water that's used by agriculture, and this is going to be one of your options for a discussion question that'll be in the discussion board.